Hello friends, in this session for Fundamentals of Management, today we are going to study about planning and the process of planning. So let's start the session by understanding the meaning and the concept of planning. Planning is the most basic function of management which involves deciding the future course of action. The other functions of management, which is organizing, staffing, directing, controlling, must reflect proper planning. Therefore, planning logically precedes the execution of all other managerial functions. And we can say that planning is unique in the sense that it establishes the objectives for the group effort that lays and also lays down the steps to accomplish them before manager proceeds to perform the other functions. Thus, we can say that planning bridges the gap from where we are today and where we want to go in the future. It also includes anticipation of the future course of events and deciding the best course of action. It is basically the process of thinking before doing, and it is a deliberate and a conscious research used to formulate the designs and orderly sequence of actions through which it is expected to reach the objectives. So, we can say that planning is a systematic attempt to decide a particular course of action for the future. It also leads to the determination of objectives of the group activity and the steps which are involved to achieve the organizational goals. Therefore, we can say that planning is an intellectual activity which involves vision and foresightness to decide the things to be done in the future. It involves the mental skills for the achievement of group activities. Planning is also the selection amongst the various alternatives. Planning is a choice making activity. The planning process involves finding the alternatives and the selection of the best alternative to achieve the specific objectives or goals of the organization. We can see that planning is a pervasive function of management because all managers, although the character and the breadth of planning will vary with their authority and with the nature of policies and plans outlined by their superiors. Various authors have cited the meaning of planning and they've given the definitions. For example, in the words of Kellen, we can say that planning is the process of deciding in advance what to be done, who is to do it, how it is to be done, and when it is to be done. Therefore, we can say that planning is an intellectual activity which involves the selection of alternatives for the future course of action and which leads to the fulfillment of the organizational goals. So now let's discuss the process of planning. Though it is difficult to specify the steps which are involved in the process of planning for various organizations in the modern era because that depends upon their difference in their size, functioning and complexity. Nevertheless, it is possible to suggest some important steps for effective planning. The steps which can be applicable for most of the organization can be number 1, establishing the objectives for the organization. As we all know, planning is an intellectual process which an executive carries out to achieve the organizational goal. But before executing any process, there comes one basic question that what is the objective of doing a job? So the first step in the planning process is the determination of the objectives. Objectives provides direction to various activities in the enterprise. And moreover, planning has no utility if it is not related to particular objective. Thus, at times what happens, it becomes more important to establish objectives than the objectives themselves because their establishment emphasizes how various people and units fit into the overall organizational framework. The formulation of this process can also be used to motivate individuals to achieve objectives which they have helped to establish. Therefore, objectives clarify the task to be accomplished and the overall objective of the organization define what is to be accomplished in general terms. Moving to the second step, which is forecasting of demand and developing strategies related to the competition, demand, government policies, etc. Sufficient information must be completed or collected in order to make plans and sub-plans. Necessary information includes the critical assessment for current status of the organization together with a forward look at the environment that is anticipated. Thus, the assessment of external environment may consider the strong and the weak points of the organization. Collection of information and making forecasts serve as the most important basis of planning. The third step is the development of planning premises. This step involves making assumptions concerning the behavior of external and internal factors mentioned in the second step. It is essential to identify the assumptions on which the plans will be based. Therefore, we can say that these assumptions denote the expected environment in the future, and at times they are also known as planning premises. As we know, forecasting is important in premising. It helps in making realistic assumptions. For example, we can say about its sales, cost, price, products, technological developments, etc. in the future. The assumptions along with the future forecast provide the basis of the plans. Since future environment is so complex and uncertain, it would not be realistic to make assumptions in greater details about the environmental factor. Therefore, it is advisable to limit the premising to those factors which are critical or strategic to the planning process. Moving ahead in the planning process, the fourth step is about searching of alternatives. Usually, there are several alternatives which are available to achieve a particular plan. The planner must try to find out all possible alternatives. Without resorting to such a research, he is likely to be guided by limited imagination. At the time of finding or developing alternatives, the planner should try to screen out the most unviable alternative so that there are only limited number of alternatives for detailed analysis. It may also be noted that determination of alternative plans can be time-consuming task because objectives have been established initially may be found to be inflexible. So, it is also possible that the assumptions need revision in the light of changed circumstances. After searching of various alternatives, we need to evaluate the alternatives, which is the fifth step in the planning process. Once alternative action plans have been determined, they must be evaluated with reference to considerations like cost, long-range objectives, limited resources, expected payback, and so on and so further. Many quantitative techniques are available to evaluate alternatives. The manager must take the help of these techniques to reach to the most optimum results. After evaluating the alternatives, it is the time to select the best course of action or plan. The best possible alternative may be chosen by the manager after detailed analysis. Sometimes, evaluation of alternatives may disclose that there are two or more courses of action that are advisable, and so the concerned manager may need to choose two or more alternatives and combine them to suit the requirements of the organization. After identifying, selecting, and evaluating the alternatives, it's time for the implementation. So the next step is the implementation of plans. It is the final step in the planning process. It is to develop and implement the selected course of action. The derivative plans are required to support the basic or overall plan because the latter cannot be executed effectively unless it is supported by derivative or sub-plans. The derivative plans are developed within the framework of the basic overall plan. And the last step in the planning process is about the follow-up action and the review. After the plan has been put into action or practice, it is essential to follow it up so that to remove difficulties in its implementation in the near future. If needed, the plan even be modified or revised to achieve the intended objectives. So this was all about the planning process. Though there is no specific process about planning for which needs to be undertaken by all the organization, but these 8 steps were the basic requirements which are required in the process of planning.